Health, Faculty of Public Health, Diponegoro University, Dr. Yusniar Hanani Darundiati, STPMKes, the honored lecturers of the Department of Environmental Health, Faculty of Public Health, Diponegoro University, our honored moderator, Mrs. Septiria Irawati MKM, and also our dearest participant of the Undip Global Classroom. Honorable guest speaker, respected lecturers, and all of these distinguished participants, welcome to the Undip Global Classroom 2026, organized by the Faculty of Public Health, Diponegoro University.
Thank you very much. I have to admit, I didn't realize I was going to have such a esteemed audience. I thought it was a student class. So forgive me that I have actually prepared my presentation as if though it's for the students. But I do acknowledge the senior leadership sitting in the seminar and webinar. And I also thank you, of course, for the opportunity to share some of our work. I think I will start sharing my screen with you because I know that our time together is limited. So hopefully that should be coming through. Please do forgive me. I do have two screens in front of me. One has my presentation on it, and the other one is actually the Zoom. So we'll just make sure that all are functioning reasonably well and we don't have any distraction from good old email. So as mentioned, my name is Serena Lockmich-Tompkins. I am on the lands of Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne, in Australia, where I actually do a lot of work on climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and resilience in the context of maternal and child health. So thank you, Septiria, for inviting me to deliver this presentation. Again, it is really wonderful and nice to connect on this work that we actually share together. And of course, potentials for collaboration and teaching and so on and so forth are always very welcome, since I already do quite a bit of work with my colleagues in Indonesia through Universitas Indonesia. So what I thought about today is to tell you a very little bit about myself, and then to introduce you to the concept of triple planetary crisis, the idea of climate change and what does this actually mean in the context of maternal and child health. Now, I think at any given time, if there's any questions that you have or that you would like to sort of discuss some of the components, please do feel free to let me know, and I'm more than happy to stop and have a conversation together. So I work at Monash University, where I lead a group that looks at the climate change and sustainable healthcare, and the population on which we focus are mothers and babies, young children under the age of 5. This work has been in progress for about 5 years now, and it's a little bit of an unusual research group because it combines my clinical expertise in digital healthcare as well as my interest and knowledge in climate change, and the fact that I am a pediatric nurse by background, and I've spent quite a lot of time clinically working with mothers that are expecting children with rare diseases. And so all the way through the pregnancy, delivery of these babies through emergency cesareans, and then taking them through the care pathway within the hospital. The difference now with the work that I do is that a lot of my work is not located within the hospitals, but rather with the communities. And I must admit that that's probably my most enjoyable part of my work, serving the community that I work with. So the journey starts really in context of understanding what exactly is happening with our planet. And I'm not sure how many of you will be familiar, but in about 2009, there was this concept of planetary health boundaries that was introduced. And really what it meant to signify is the idea that there is only so much Earth can take before systems within it start to disintegrate and start to sort of fail in supporting the life that exists on the Earth itself. So if you look at this diagram, for example, what the scientists are suggesting is that if you think about this boundary as a planetary boundary, the green area is where it's a safe operating space for the planet, but anything outside of this green framework, if you like, becomes hazard in terms of being able to sustain life. Now, when the model was first released, it had 7 boundaries. That was the climate change, biosphere integrity, so looking at the animal and living life, anything to do with land system change, obviously what's occurring with our fresh water, what's occurring with the planet itself in terms of sulfur cycle and nitrogen cycles, for example, as well as phosphorus, and then what is occurring in terms of ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol loading, and of course the good old ozone. Now, there was also a boundary at that time which was considered as a novel entity, and it wasn't defined yet, but it was thought that it might actually contribute what happens in terms of that ability to support life. So across time, this has actually evolved. And initially, 7 boundaries in 2009 were considered getting assessed, and then, of course, 3 of them being crossed, which was climate change, biosphere integrity, and the biogeochemical flows. But then as you have a movement across 2015 and 2023, you can see that more of these boundaries have been broken. And what that means is that instead of being in that nice living space where the planet can function to support existing human, animal and plant life, we are now tipping into this zone where it's actually not certain what happens with this ability to support things. So you'll often hear people talking about tipping points for ocean, for fresh water, for air quality. And it's always trying to sort of discuss how do we avoid those tipping points in order to sustain life overall. So again, the more you go towards the outer parts, towards this darker red area, the more uncertain it is what the modeling can actually predict, particularly in the context of climate change, what this future might look like. Now, in 2025, these things were actually reevaluated, and what you can actually see in this case is that novel entities, which are now considered to be microplastics, have been exceeded. You obviously have climate change exceeding, but most significantly have a significant loss of the actual living organisms, so the animal and plant. And most people will say that we now live in the greatest extinction time since the dinosaur times. So if you think about this in terms of the ability to support life, any change in air quality, land's ability to deliver agricultural products, for example, the ability of fresh water to be supplied for drinking, or oceans to supply fish, we are all impacted in terms of how we exist on these lands and what that means, both in terms of income and the social support, but also our own health. And what this means is that as we go more towards these darker red zones, if you like, or very high risk zones, you can also see that if you compare, for example, the planetary health, which is that upper area here, and the human health underneath it, that the more we move into that outward direction and trajectory, the more risks we have in terms of what happens to our health. And this is not, unreasonable. If you think about it, it's actually quite logical, because if you have the loss of forests, for example, on the land, not only do you lose the capacity to filter the carbon or sequester the carbon from the air into the trees, for example, you also then have the loss of the quality of the soil, which then, of course, impacts what happens to the productive land that can then impact the number of jobs and social stability for the society. Similar with oceans, that more acidic the oceans become, the less able the fish are to survive in there. That as the fish population then declines, of course, that impacts the ability to be able to produce income through fisheries. And of course, in terms of human health, you're looking at things such as loss of protein from the fish, and then, of course, the social income that comes from jobs and being able to support good family life. So for us, the concept really is sitting within climate change. And for those of you who don't know, what we are really looking at is the warming of the Earth's atmosphere, because the amount of polluting particles that are coming through carbon emissions from the fossil fuels, but also other pollutants, we're actually changing the way the air is circulating, but also the way the heat's actually being trapped and how much of it is reflecting back to the Earth's surface. What this then means is that when we have this extra heat being trapped within the atmosphere and unable to escape out, we then have the rising of the surface of the temperatures that are also, impacting not just the land, but the sea and the water and so on. I won't go much into depth in this space, but what I really want to emphasize is this fifth step, is that is the sort of key point, if you like, in terms of how we impact what's occurring with the changes within the atmosphere and the climate itself. If human activities continue to expand in terms of burning fossil fuels and in terms of how we use land for agriculture, and particularly in terms of clearing, that ongoing production of the greenhouse into the atmosphere means that we are going to be increasingly meeting greater frequency, intensity, and duration of natural hazard disasters, but also sea level rise and so on. But more importantly, it gets us into that unpredictable area in terms of what does the climate future look like for population health in particular. And where do we actually go if we know that the current mitigation strategies are not sufficient to stop the planet from heating more than 0.5 degrees, sorry, 1.5 degrees of Celsius, as agreed to by Paris Agreement. So there's a lot to think about in terms of, not just this model of increasing heat and production of mitigation, but also even within the adaptation space, is that if we're constantly shifting the margin in terms of what the adaptation would look like, well, how do we build on the existing systems and infrastructure to support what needs to change? And of course, if you're looking at this in the concept of human health, often we'll think about the immediate things such as heat and humidity and air. But really, we also need to be thinking about this from that socio-ecological perspective, which is that every time we have sea surface level rising from the melting glaciers and ice sheets, we actually have salination of the soil taking place. So all those coastal communities then start to be impacted by this sea level rise, not just in terms of agriculture and production, but also livelihoods. And what that means is that all our identity as human beings and the cultural and religious connections that we have to those lands are threatened by these changes. And so any shift of population from those areas, even if you are trying to protect the physical health, there is the concept also of mental health and well-being that is being impacted, because we are asking people to think where to live somewhere else that is not necessarily congruent with their cultural identity and belief, but also the practices required to protect their health. So that indigenous traditional knowledge that is specific to that area becomes a challenge as well. In terms of physiology and mental health, really, if you're thinking about the climate change, what we are looking, of course, is that rising ambient temperature together with humidity. So in the context of extreme heat, we are looking at heat-related illnesses, whether they're from cardiac or neurological component. But we're also looking at respiratory issues that are occurring, particularly for those when there's a combination of heat, humidity, and pollen, for example. With severe weather coming through rising temperatures, we're also looking at increasing trauma and injuries. We're also looking at mental health impacts that come again with that threat of what occurs within our living space. Air pollution is a no-brainer. It's really important to recognize that air pollution is not climate change itself, but rather it's one contributing factor to climate change. We know that having increased air pollution means that there is an increased trapping of the air. There's an increased level of polluting air that is also trapping that heat. And of course, they feed off each other. One is not separate from the other. But if we are talking about air pollution, we are again looking at increased asthma and cardiovascular disease. And for children, this is particularly problematic. And for those of you who are in ecology, you'll know that increased carbon levels means better production in terms of plant growth, but also means more flowering, more pollen, and therefore more presentations of asthma to the hospitals. So all these things become really important as you're learning how to manage the healthcare service or how to provide even basic healthcare within a community. Then, of course, there is the issue of changing in vector-borne diseases. So what's happening in terms of dengue fever, malaria, yellow fever, Japanese encephalitis, all these things that would have been confined to a particular area of the planet are now moving as the planet warms up to the areas where they didn't exist before. And that then means for healthcare professionals that they really have to be mindful about what services they will provide in the future and what will that actually look like in the context of maternal and child health provision. Because in many places, for example, we don't necessarily have very good obstetric and pediatric services to be able to support the health requirements. And of course, one important component is that of environmental degradation. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just our own health that is being impacted, it's also the soil and water. So all the chemical bleaching that occurs into the environment, for example, the fact that the fresh water is becoming more scarce means that people will be competing for those areas where these resources are actually available. So now we need to be thinking about the impacts of forced migration, potential civil conflict, conflict. And of course, all these things, again, tie back to mental health and well-being and to the good survival within the country itself. Now, in the context of healthcare system, we really have to be thinking about the climate change, both in terms of the vulnerability factor. So where are the weak points within the healthcare system? So the hospitals, primary healthcare centers, but then also that health risk that comes from populations. So what that means is that the hospitals not only need to meet the needs of the population that is mostly sick, so for example, those with chronic diseases, they have to plan for further pressures on the healthcare services through that increased demand. And that means perhaps more presentations of people through trauma injuries or more presentation through, for example, asthma and so on. But the health system itself has to think about very carefully what happens in terms of that capacity and resilience. What do we need in terms of leadership and governance and policies to make sure that these changes occur? And I don't know how many of you work in the healthcare system, but what you find is that the most healthcare systems are reactive to immediate situation. There's very little capacity within the health system to actually think in the long term. So what the situation will be 5, 10 years from track. And this is, of course, understandable because we all function on a very short funding regimes rather than having that prospective long-term thinking ability to kind of minimize some of these risks and where they're going. So if we are now thinking about the models of care of how we're going to reduce some of these impacts as the climate changes, we need to be asking about the social determinants of health. So what's happening with housing, what's happening with the, policy, what's happening with the systems that are surrounding these people. But also, as we develop these plans, we need to be thinking about how do we minimize our own impact on the environmental determinants of health. So again, the land on which we live, the air we breathe, the water we drink. And I mentioned earlier this idea that everything is also combining the human qualities, including cultural determinants of health. So who you are, what you are, where do you live? The other thing that makes it really complex for healthcare systems, regardless of whether it's a maternal and child health context or any other, is that we globally have a healthcare workforce shortage. Now, in some countries, this may not be an issue, but what is an issue for them is that their healthcare workforce is exported to global north countries, meaning that there will be a shortage of a different kind. And so trying to meet the needs of your own population while actually having a large export of healthcare workforce elsewhere is also something that needs to be thought through. And with healthcare workforce, what we find at the moment is that most of them don't know much about climate change. Not everybody is disaster prepared, and not everybody is ready to kind of step into that long-term adaptation process. In Indonesia, you obviously are exposed to many natural hazard disasters, meaning that your healthcare workforce is much more aware of disasters, and there's lots for us in other countries to learn from Indonesia. But at the same time, the workforce does require additional education in terms of the climate-related impacts. So what's actually happening in that context of the weather impact, sea level rise, and so on. And of course, if you think about, how do you look at your healthcare systems? How do you prepare them? At any given time, most of us will be thinking about the natural hazard disasters. And really, the climate adaptation and resilience is actually asking you to go further than just repairing and responding and recovering from natural hazard disasters. It's actually asking you to think about climate change almost as a chronic condition. That means that there's a constant state of preparedness to address whatever the issues might be. Many of you will know that with natural hazard, there's a huge emergencies, massive casualties, and response to that is really required. But in terms of climate change, we're actually seeing this gradual increase, for example, of heat wave impacts on people over time. And the younger you are and the older you are, the more vulnerable you are to these environmental components. So the World Health Organization has come up with the operational frameworks in how you could look at the healthcare systems to make them more resilient. But fundamentally, they are coming back down to supporting the healthcare workforce and being able to have a healthcare workforce that is able to both be in a space of mitigation, so reducing the carbon footprint, but also adaptation and resilience. And that ongoing assessment to make sure that your healthcare systems are actually able to respond to whatever the climate pressures will be. And for example, if you're living in a coastal area and your hospital is constantly inundated by the sea level rise and you have these coastal floods occurring on a daily basis, and you don't have an option to move that healthcare system, well, what's the next best model that you can employ in that setting, knowing in particular that the population is actually there to provide care for? Or alternatively, in Australia, for example, parts of Australia will be non-livable because it's going to be so hot that the populations will more than likely move from those regions closer to the centers, the cities, in order to receive the services required. And we are probably looking at the stages of carbon future of the climate future where we will probably not have the hospitals located in the same place anymore. But what it also means is that you need to be looking at the climate data and the GIS distribution modeling across next 50 to 100 years to identify where these hospitals are going to be, particularly if you are in an island and the sea levels are rising, there's a sinking issue, then you need to be not just thinking where to build them, but how do you build them differently so that they can be resilient. The most important part in all of this is that as we are not on a trajectory to minimize the carbon emissions into the atmosphere, we really need to be thinking about different types of scenarios of what this means of the impact on health if you are born, for example, today and you'll be 70 in 2020 versus being 70-year-old in 2100. And if we know that the worse the climate scenario, the more impacts we will wait to see. And of course, that will impact not just the quality of life, but also the duration of the life that we have. So for mothers and children, this is a particularly vulnerable issue because both are physiologically and socially in quite vulnerable positions to be able to both adjust and respond. Now, when we talk about our work, we're really looking at maternal health being defined as the health of women during pregnancy, childbirth, and in our case, the postnatal period of up to about 5 age of a child. And the child health is actually defined again for children under the age of 5. And this is mostly to correspond to WHO definition that is actually looking at that early morbidity and mortality in young children. In our context, we refer to climate change specifically to the one that is contributed to human activities rather than a natural process. And then when we talk about the adaptation, we are really looking at the adjustments that people can make to actual or expected impacts of climate in order to actually minimize the harm, but also optimize the opportunities to live well. And when we talk about the mitigation of climate change, of course, that means any human intervention that can lead to a minimization of carbon in the atmosphere. But also the mitigation component can involve other components to minimize the risks of harm. So now we're looking at things, that are technologies or processes or practices that can contribute to the mitigation. So in terms of reducing that carbon impact. So anything to do with being able to implement renewable energies, or how do we manage the massive amounts of waste being produced by societies all the time? And also, how do we shift people's attitudes to recognize that that our behavior does have an impact on the planet, and that really investing into public health services and public systems in general is actually a good, not just good for the economy, but good for the planet as well. The threats to maternal and child health is so broad and so significant in terms of climate change that the World Health Organization actually issued a call for action in 2023, recognizing that climate change is one of the gravest threats to the health of future generations. And we know that without a healthy mother, there is no healthy child, there's no healthy infant. And of course, we also know that what occurs during preconception, during pregnancy, and in those early 1,000 days of life impacts the child long term into adulthood. So really, when you think about the public health interventions since the Second World War, we spent a lot of time trying to minimize these harms to mothers and babies, now facing not only geopolitical instabilities and issues that occur in the world, there is also, of course, that environmental element associated with climate. So it's a really complex environment. It's also really under-researched. And our work has shown that any intervention that supports mother and child is always sort of done from top down and hardly ever involving the mothers as a decision making, but also families as a decision making. Although our work talks about maternal and child health, it's really important to recognize that this is a responsibility of all of the communities, and fathers themselves in particularly play an important role, both in terms of supporting pregnancy, gender equity, but also the early childhood development. So when I talk about maternal and child health, please don't feel that I'm putting the whole responsibility on the mother. It is actually responsibility of all of us. And what that looks like for each society and each culture will be different, of course. But overall, it does need to act towards protecting the future health of our nations, really. So in this call for climate change, what the World Health Organization recognizes is that the impacts are either direct or indirect. So when we talk about the direct impacts, we're really talking about things such as, for example, heat waves impacting physiology of pregnancy, the health of the mother and health of the child. But when we talk about the indirect impacts, we're looking again at the impacts of extreme temperature, for example, on the ability to produce enough food for that household. So again, you can see how all these things are very connected. You cannot look at the health just from the health point of view. You need all the disciplines to come together. You need the environmental biologists, you need the urban designers, you need the policymakers, you need the engineers. Everybody has a place at the table to try not just strengthen the health system sustainability, but also actually promote health for future generations as well as now. In our work, we also tend to use socio-ecological framework a lot in order to identify the prevention points for harm. And, we specifically talk about human health, but I think this particular framework is really wonderful because it also allows you to think about the biodiversity. So how do we impact the world around us? What we know from the human health perspective and from the health promotion is that even if an individual is really well educated and knows a lot about the health and climate change impacts of health, if their position within the family, within the community, within the society is impacted, they may not be able to use that knowledge to protect their health or their child's health. So that means that we never function as one single entity, and that decision that we make is impacted by many factors. So when we look at protecting maternal and child health or increasing communities' ability to protect maternal and child health, we need to be looking at this problem from multiple levels. So, of course, the individual, but also what happens at family level, the friends level. Who is your social network? How do you connect with that social network? What are the organization in there that can support you? And I think Indonesia does this really good in the context of natural hazard disasters, in trying to support their populations and respond really well to kind of bring the community together. One thing that I was really impressed about in Indonesia when I visited about 2 years ago now is that the health cadre, which is mostly composed of women, had this incredible ability to organize their community and actually pull together and really identified pregnant women and actually take them to a safe shelter spot, because that community-based organization, that connection within the community and between those women was so fantastic. I also met a police officer who was trying to organize the youth within that community to really give young men in particular a role in that disaster response, in that adaptation context, particularly because this community was frequently impacted by sea level rise. So again, lots of these things have to be looked at from multiple levels. And this is what makes this research really challenging. You can't have one single intervention and expect to have a good outcome. You really have to involve all these levels in order for that intervention to have a proper outcome, but also sustained outcome. That means that even when I'm, as a researcher, leave that community has the ownership of that work, and they can support each other in making sure that the health is actually being protected. And it also, of course, means building places differently, living differently, perhaps learning new trades and so on, based on that environmental exposure and whatever's occurring within that environment. Now, again, I've assumed that there's a lot of students in here, so and my apologies if this is a little bit too medical or too nursing for you, but I do want to capture the vulnerabilities of why it's actually really important to think about the pregnancy, pregnant women, mothers and the babies in a slightly different way to what we're used to doing. Um, During pregnancy, a female body undergoes many changes. And of course, that is in order to support the pregnancy and to support life. So we know that there is change in how the cardiovascular system works, so the heart and the blood vessels. We know that there's an increased strain on the heart in terms of having lots of blood circulating around. We know that there is remodeling of the blood vessels. So, for example, when the circulation enters the periphery, it will be responsive to the hormones in a very different way as opposed to when not being pregnant. We also know that there is a change in insulin secretion and therefore different requirements in terms of nutrition. We know also that there's a lot of energy goes into building the maternal fetal interface, which is basically the placenta, the umbilical cord in supporting life. This is really important because if we think about the interventions before conception, if we know that a local environment has been impacted by salinity and therefore the produce that is being produced is not as nutritious as it used to be, then we need to be thinking about the preconception nutrition in a very different way. That means that using local midwives, local nurses, local healthcare systems, women need to be educated that the nutrition may not be what it used to be. What's really interesting from some of the conversations we've had with midwives in Indonesia is that when preconception nutrition supplement is offered, many women will say, no, no, I don't need that. I'm very healthy. And it's only when they get to the 7th or 8th month of pregnancy that they're incredibly fatigued and have a very difficult time with reaching pregnancy for some of the populations. Now, what that means is that the women themselves may not have recognized that there's an issue with malnutrition and therefore have a perception that they're quite healthy, but only when the pregnancy demands all these changes that the body doesn't have enough to be able to meet those needs. So again, looking at the education of pregnant women and midwives and supporting this through early intervention becomes really important. And of course, it's not always appropriate. This will be specific to some communities, and identifying those communities where these vulnerabilities are important becomes a priority, I think. Now, when it comes to the baby, everything within the developing fetus is actually underdeveloped. So if you look at the immune system, there really is hardly anything there in terms of being able to defend against, for example, some of the really harsh bacteria that might come through failure of water and sanitation services. You might find that if the mother doesn't have sufficient amount of antibodies, then the amount of antibodies that get through to the fetus through passive immunity is also challenged. You might be thinking about the fact that at this stage, the nervous system is rapidly developing. So again, a lot of nutrition is required for that to occur. Very similar in terms of respiratory system. During pregnancy, there is no air exchange. It's only when the baby is born and takes that first breath that the lungs are actually then starting to properly develop. So if this infant is born into the highly polluted environment, you can think about that first breath containing lots of pollution going into that developing body. And of course, that then impacts what happens in terms of neuronal development. Very similar with newborn physiology. It's a time of very rapid growth. You'll know yourself that many of you will know that, baby is born anywhere between 2.9 and 4 kilograms. And from there on, lots of things occur very rapidly in terms of development and maturation. So again, how these systems develop is very much impacted not just by the genetics, but also by the environment in which we live. So massive exposure to heat waves, for example, mean that the infant is at risk of seizures and significant heat illness because the blood vessels are not developed in a way that can help them release heat. The thermoregulatory center in the brain is not developed enough in these newborns and infants to regulate the release of body heat. So we all need to be thinking about is what's the best way to reduce the temperature to which the newborn is exposed to minimize the risks. And of course, what happens when something is really humid? How do we change these components? And what happens in terms of the heat also, it's not just in terms of what happens outside in the environment. Even if you're inside of your own house, the amount of heat that comes through is problematic if you don't have airflow through. So how do we design houses? How do we position our windows? How do we ensure that there's some airflow to reduce the heat impacts becomes really important as well. So you can already see the location for the architects to think differently, for engineers to think differently, because when we design these buildings, they actually need to be sustaining what occurs in terms of ability to provide safe environment for the newborn to develop. Children continue to be vulnerable to heat impacts as well as to bacterial infection through water and sanitation services. For example, if they're not working really well and there's pollution from the floods that comes in, vector-borne diseases and so on. And again, it comes down to their physiological vulnerability. So the fact that their thermoregulatory center is still developing means again that they will be more vulnerable to this heat and humidity impact. And again, we also know very little about what happens during floods. There is the logical impact of, losing your housing and being exposed to bacteria, but also what happens when children are continuously exposed to skin aggravating conditions that, for example, might lead to skin disease of some form. So again, lots of things to consider, again, relevant to that developmental stage. And this is just physiology. We haven't even talked about the cognitive and social development of children, which again becomes a really important factor of the environment as well. So from my perspective, I don't think we can really study climate change impacts on anyone, and particularly not on the outcomes of pregnancy and early childhood, unless we bring all these elements together. So really, not just thinking about the direct and indirect impacts of climate change, but also what is that social built environment, what is happening in terms of policies and regulations existing to support people. And again, a lot of countries are trying to do their best, but I think because things still exist a lot in silos, we may not necessarily be doing as much as we could if we actually brought everybody at the table. For example, nursing and midwifery workforce, and of course I'm biased here because I belong to that workforce, has a really incredible close connection to community, yet you hardly ever see nurses and midwives at the discussion tables of these elements. And when we are in the room, most people, don't necessarily recognize the expertise that we have in connection to the community. Very similar occurs when we have people who come into health from other disciplines. They're not necessarily seen straight away for the value that they bring. So really, if you're looking at maternal and child health perspective and protecting that, bringing all these disciplines together and actually being a mediator amongst these disciplines becomes really important component. Fundamentally, if you're thinking about what needs to be looked at in terms of priorities, particularly if we're looking at the exposure all the way from pregnancy onwards, you really need to be thinking about how do we talk to populations about, for example, protecting pregnancy from the fetal distress associated with environmental exposure. What do we do in terms of preterm birth and birth defects, or even the mortality that might occur associated with these environmental hazards? We also need to be thinking about how do we invest into that early childhood screening process to perhaps identify those who might be at the risk of malnutrition or asthma or any other condition that occurs. Now, the other important thing is that we know quite a bit about the impacts on the mother and the offspring and the fetus when it comes to climate, but we know very little about the impacts on the fathers. So we at this stage think that there is an impact on adverse health effect of the fathers, also the paternal health, because there is some evidence that microplastics, for example, will be impacting the sperm counts, but also that the quality of the sperm might be impacted in the context of environmental exposure to different hazards. So again, a lot is not known in this space, particularly from the paternal side. But I think overall, we need to be thinking about this in the context of that if the child is exposed during pregnancy to these environmental hazards, what does the future look like for this child? And what investments do we need to make either to minimize the risks of negative outcomes or more, or just as importantly, what do we need to do to minimize, so as to invest into healthcare systems and other social systems, including education, to support better outcomes for these children through education? I don't need to tell you much about this because I think you'll all be aware that water-related illnesses continue to be an issue for maternal and child health, but also for general populations. So I cannot stress enough the need for water and sanitation services and good engineering of that, particularly where you've got sea level rise. What does that actually look like for these populations becomes really important. Waste management services also become important in this space. And, you know, the distribution of these conditions in any country, including Indonesia, will be changing over time, as will be the season. So again, looking how that relates back to the healthcare system pressure and the health pressure becomes really important. The vector-borne diseases, again, would be quite significant. Another issue that is occurring with these conditions is that they do impact the ability to produce food. And that means that if we have failure of crops in particular, or unstable crop yield because of the food insecurity caused by whatever climate change is occurring, we are then actually also impacting that maternal and child health. So again, you can see that all these systems are related to one another. It's not just the absence of disease that is actually an issue here. We are looking at all relevant events that occur that are related to climate and weather. Okay. Heat illness, again, going back very briefly to this, please recognize that this is a multiple component that, you know, we are looking not just, you know, not necessarily feeling very well. We're also looking at issues of dehydration, and an increased risk of stroke because of the fact that there's a decreased stroke volume getting to the nervous system. We are looking at lower blood pressure. And again, if you're really young, pregnant, or really old, these issues become quite significant. I know that Indonesia, this will be different to Australia because Australian heat is much drier than Indonesian. In Indonesia, I think humidity is the main issue, and heat and humidity in combination are quite lethal. So looking at what that looks like in terms of housing, healthcare system development, maternal and obstetric child services, again, becomes really important because everything you build to provide that obstetric service should really be guided to minimize these risks overall. Again, I won't go much into this as well. Please consider air pollution as one of the key factors in terms of minimizing risk to maternal and child health. Again, as I mentioned earlier, is that if you have increased pollution, whether it's coming from burning of fossil fuels, but even of the wildfires or bushfires, you are definitely looking at adverse health effects. So for mothers, that might be things such as hypertension, which is high blood pressure. There's also issue of postpartum or afterbirth depression. There's also problems with placental abruption, so when the placenta actually tears. And we know for a fact that the preterm birth and infant mortality are increased in association with air pollution, as is the low birth weight and the respiratory, so the lung development. Again, all these things need to be considered in terms of policies and procedures to minimize that impact on health of future generations. One interesting component, which I think was a bit surprising to me, I don't know why it was, because when I thought about it logically, it kind of made perfect sense. But I mentioned earlier that as the planet gets warmer, we're actually going to get more production of pollen and allergens that will be in the air. And when combined with heat and humidity, we are actually going to have an increased frequency and severity, not just of those natural events, but also what occurs in respiratory health. In Australia, we have this term called thunderstorm asthma, and it's actually an awful event a few years ago when we were not prepared when it first happened. What actually meant is that a very rapid sequence of change in the weather has made a lot of pollen encapsulated, which end up in the respiratory tract, and quite few people died from that event. We've learned from that. We're now prepared, and these days there's an early warning system for thunderstorm asthma if there is a possibility of high volume of pollen in the air followed by a very huge storm coming through. So people are aware of this. It's possible to get Ventolin, which is one of the medications that is a first aid for asthma, and basically prepare for that event if it occurs. A lot of people are advised to stay at home or be near the hospital when this event comes through. So the idea of early warning system is actually a really important one as well. For us, it's a thunderstorm asthma, but there's also the heat early warning for heat and heat waves. And of course, in Indonesia, I'm sure you'll have something in relation to floods and so on. In addition to pollen, we're also looking at what happens in flooding. So one other component that is really important to recognize is the presence of mold and spores that are associated with mold, and the fact that they too are associated in some cases with asthma. So again, how you protect the dwellings from mold development when you have floods or frequent floods and compounding impacts of these disasters is again stuff that we really need to tackle from that public health point of view. One important part to recognize with cardiovascular illness is that it is a death and life thing as well. And so whenever you have early warning systems, you really should be thinking about including your healthcare system into these early warning situations, so that if you do have extreme heat or severe weather or fire or any other natural hazard disasters, your hospitals really should be part of this, particularly in terms of obstetrics and pediatrics, because we know that many shelters will not actually be prepared for obstetric emergencies. So for example, an urgent birth or complicated birth, if, for example, there's no access to healthcare at that time. I won't go into this slide very much, except to say that a lot of people are putting a lot more effort into trying to identify what insect and tick related diseases we'll need to be worrying about. In Australian setting, that is Lyme disease, that is increasingly an issue. But there will be other issues for different countries where the population needs to be considered. And this is where that issue of deforestation becomes really important, and the mixture between the populations and animals in particular is sort of less defined, because we have invaded into the forests and into the territory of insects and ticks, and therefore likelihood of getting some of these conditions occurring in general populations is increasing. So we need to think about this from that planetary health point of view, particularly because in the context of maternal and child health, many of these conditions could lead to death basically in the end. I didn't talk much about mental health impacts, but I do want you to be aware of this. Again, going back to that socio-ecological model, when you are exposed to multiple natural hazard disasters, as I'm sure your society will know, the pressure on an individual to do something about it, to adjust to it, is enormous, particularly if you're a community leader who is expected to make a change. Helping people understand how climate change impacts that community helps both the community leaders and the community members understand that some of these things are beyond human input, and that knowing that the changes within the planet are responsible for some of these components alleviates some of that pressure on the mind in terms of what to do and how to do it. And of course, then there is the pressure in terms of responding to these natural hazard disasters. So one important component of research, not just for maternal and child health, but broader, is how do we set up those healthcare, social, and community networks to basically support people through this really difficult time. And also, what does this mean in terms of employment, in terms of having access to water and sanitation services? And how do we redevelop many of these things to support people in terms of minimizing that mental load that occurs in each of these components? Naturally, the more of these disasters occur, and the more we have deterioration of social, ecological, and cultural determinants of health, the harder it is to address the mental health issue components. So I think being able to think about this in a sort of preventative way becomes a really important component. So really, I think I've shared with you quite a lot about things that we've learned over time. I'm actually visiting Indonesia from the 7th, 8th of June to the 18th of June. So I get to learn a lot more about Indonesia and how they cope with many of these things. I think there's a lot for Australia to learn in this space from Indonesia. And I certainly, every time I visit, I learn something new. But I think fundamentally, we need to share a lot more knowledge in terms of what prevention looks like in climate change and what does the adaptation look like? What will our services look like, 50 or even 10 years from now? And more importantly, how do we break these silos to work more together? And how do we recognize each other for the expertise that we bring? Fundamentally, there will always be things that we can do better. But I also find that there's a lot of waste with what we do. And a lot of that waste occurs because we don't talk to one another and we don't learn from experts as we should. So I think, one thinking point here is, if we are building early warning systems, what should we be thinking about from that holistic point of view? If we are building disaster shelters, have we thought about how to deal with those shelters if we have somebody who goes into labor? What do we do if we have a child being born into a disaster and there's no access to clean water and sanitation? What does that first aid in that moment look like? So I think there's a lot to learn. There's lots to share. There are many case studies that we could work on together. And for me personally, preventing the harm to health to future generations is an incredibly important job to do. And I very much look forward to seeing where this takes us and how we do this together. So I think I'll stop there and thank you very much for your time. I hope that there will be some questions for the conversation. And of course, Miss Ira is welcome to share, Ima rather, is welcome to share my details for those of you who might want to take the conversation beyond the seminar. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zerina. Okay, I hope you still have time to get a discussion with us. Maybe
Absolutely.
from the student first, is there anyone who wants to ask about the presentation or the material that has been delivered by Dr. Zerina, please? Because the time is so short, right, Dr. Zerina? I'm so sorry, and
No,
thank
don't
you
be
for
sorry.
your
It's okay.
precious time. Okay, maybe
It's lovely to
what
connect.
yes, I'm so glad can talk directly to you because Rona is often share about her PhD life and share about how you supervise her. So I'm really interested to get more and know more about you and your expert here. Maybe while waiting from a question from our students, I want to share and ask you about the topic. Actually, talking about the climate change sometimes makes me feel desperate
Hmm.
because the condition of our climate is getting worse and worse day by day. And you have been to Indonesia, right?
Yes,
How many times? How
two
many times?
times. Two times. This is going
Okay.
to be my third time.
Okay, maybe someday you can go to Semarang and come to Undip, and then we can
Yes.
get a conversation directly. So sometimes we as a person and also communities do a lot of things that we can do, like educate our neighbors, and also here in the university we talk about the climate change and how to mitigate the impact of the climate change. But sometimes I think this climate change is really, what is that? The most important factors is also the political will and also how the government can provide the condition that can make sure that the community is helped. Maybe in your opinion, me here as a new lecturer here, actually, I've just here for almost 2 years. What can I do as a lecturer and maybe for our students too, as the students of public health, that can help to make this condition better? And how to make us not what is that, not give up with this condition. Maybe you can give us some advice or opinion about it. Yes, please. Thank you.
I don't know if I can give it advice and an opinion. What I can tell you is how it feels for me and what I think I do.
Mhm.
And maybe in some of that information, you might find something that works for you. I think it's really important that we don't give up fighting for the health of the planet and health of the people. And no matter how hard things are, if good people do nothing, then we all gonna go down the hill. So as long as we have good people doing at least something, then that is a very important step to do. I have a young daughter, and my ambition is to leave this world a better place for her. And, if she has children down the track, better world for her children. And that does require commitment. And it also means that I don't have a normal job. I don't work from, 8 hours. I work all the time because for me, climate change and supporting people's health is a mission in my life. I don't think that's for everybody, but what is for everybody is to make a decision to do different every day. So, for example, if you can reuse a cup, then you get a reusable cup. If you know that you can, use non-disposables, use non-disposables. When I was in Indonesia, for example, I saw a lot of use of plastic, like particularly wrapping plastic. Everything was wrapped. And I'm sure that there's a reason for it. But at the same time, the question would be, if you have to wrap it in plastic, could you make it a different kind of plastic that is made from potato peel, for example? Or I don't know, something like that. So it's even pushing the products and pushing innovation is really important. How we use technology is really important. We know that AI is not environmentally sustainable. So can we then be responsible users of AI, not use it for everything, but only for stuff that really matters? So it's about the choices we make. With respect to governments, I think it's really important to recognize that um, governments will never do an ideal job, and there will always be, things that they can do better. But it's also important to recognize that there are champions at every level that will work with you to make things better. So, for example, Australian government and Indonesian government have a lot of investment through grants to support climate adaptation in Indonesia, and it's how our work is funded. So people are trying to do things. I think where things get lost is in that really big picture because everybody still wants to make money in the economy, and shifting that is really hard. So really, if the bottom message is we all have to make a choice and we all have to do the best we can and lead by example. I'm
Okay,
not
so
sure if that helps you, but
it really helps me. Actually, this is like get my motivation still here. And Zerina, I have one question again about since you mentioned about the social economic and also cultural demographic that can influence the condition of the pregnant woman, do you have any research or maybe from others research? Um, what condition can make the health of the pregnant woman especially can be worse? Maybe which place can make them more vulnerable to
Mm.
this disease related to climate change or maybe other
So,
factors? Could you
mm.
please share?
So interestingly, we don't have much knowledge on Indonesia. We haven't seen epidemiological studies done that actually identify the vulnerable regions. We do know some of our research is in submission at the moment, and hopefully one of them is in a hopefully final submission before it gets out. But what we do know from Indonesian women in particular is that they're very well aware of climate change impacts on health. What they're not aware of is that climate change impacts on women's and children's health. So there's knowledge deficits there. And this is universal regardless of whether women are university educated or not. So that's really an interesting one. In terms of the areas that are most vulnerable, the coastal communities are those that we know most about. But there are many internal rural communities, distal communities that we have no idea about. So really, for Indonesia, there is little data that we can pinpoint exactly what place would be most vulnerable. What we do know is that their position in society matters. There's a lot of research on that. We also know that, if it's a more equitable partnership within families, so for example, husband and wife are working together, and then that works really well, that they do better. We also know that when there's domestic violence, they do worse. So lots of these usual social problems also translate to climate change. So this is just potentiated by climate change because this environmental pressure comes up. The other research tells us that any intervention to do with infectious diseases, for example, people have tried to implement preventative measures across the communities where dengue fever is an example. However, the problem is that none of these interventions are made in collaboration with the community. So once the study finishes, people literally drop them out. And our research has certainly showed that. So, in response to your question, what you need to be thinking about is the housing, pre-pregnancy, pregnancy, nutrition, access to health services, midwife at least, and also looking at that social network support around them. The more women are supported by their families and by the local community, the better they do, regardless of the natural hazard impact. But I can send you papers.
Thank you. And do you have any information, maybe in not only in Indonesia, maybe in other countries? Is there any, what is that, like best practice or maybe local potential or like kearifan lokal, what is that? Local heritage
Yeah.
that can be applied to help us overcome the effect of the climate change?
So you're talking about the indigenous and local knowledge.
Yep.
There is a lot of evidence of that coming from Canada and United States, and less so from Australia. I'm not aware much about the Indonesian. That's a good question. Um, there's actually a new course coming up from the Global Alliance for Climate Change Education from Columbia University. It's actually all about reproductive health. So I'll share that with you, and I think you'll learn a lot there about the potential preventative measures that still need to be evaluated. The course is international. It's going to be a better time for you than me because I'll be teaching at 11 p.m., which is not very great, but it is. It's a global course. But that I think would be a really good thing, not just for you, but for your colleagues as well.
I would
Right.
love to join that. Okay, maybe from the students, is there any question? Okay, maybe if there is no more question, I think I got a lot of things today from your presentation and also from our discussion. And I hope this is not the end. And in the future, we can communicate again and discuss again about, especially about the climate change and the effect of health. Maybe before we end this session, I would like you to give like closing statement for us to conclude your presentation.
Well, I didn't expect the last minute statement, but here we go. I think that investment in education and health always has been and should be a priority for all of us, and protecting the health of the future generations should be a priority. The only way we have healthy babies is through investing into healthy pregnancies and healthy mothers and fathers. And more importantly, I think getting all of society to come together. So once again, we need not just healthcare professionals, we need engineers, urban designers, architects, environmental scientists, everybody, climate scientists to come on board to get this problem solved. I do thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you today. I know that the students are quiet. I know it's not easy to hear a presentation in English language specifically, and I thank you once again. It's a huge privilege, and I do look forward to meeting you someday in person.
Okay, thank you so much, Zerina. Yes, I'm so sorry if there is no question from our student. Maybe they're still shy.
All good, all good.
Actually, I hope we can get another session maybe in the next program or events in the Faculty of Public Health Universitas Diponegoro. And now before we leave, and because I don't want to what is that? Your precious time. Yes, I'm so sorry. And now I will give back to Mima to lead the photo session and also close the this course. Thank you so
Thank you very
much,
much.
Dr. Zerina.
Goodbye.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Mrs. Saptiria Irawati, for the excellent moderation. And of course, our deepest gratitude to Associate Professor General Locke McTomskin, PhD, for the highly insightful and eye-opening presentation. Okay, before we close today's session, we would like to do a photo session together. So to all of the participants, you may please turn on your camera because we're gonna do a photo documentation session together.
Sepertinya Dokter Zerinanya sudah live. Tidak
Oke,
apa-apa.
baik.
Kita foto aja nggak apa-apa.
Oke, yuk teman-teman bisa on cam yuk, teman-teman. Ayo mungkin ditunggu sampai 12, mungkin ditunggu sampai 12:08 ya teman-teman. Yuk bisa on cam yuk.
Nggak apa-apa, seadanya aja, Mima.
Oke, oke mungkin saya bantu hitung. Ada 4 slide ya teman-teman. Oke, mungkin slide pertama dulu. 1, 2, 3. Oke, selanjutnya slide kedua. 1, 2, 3. Oke, lalu slide ketiga. Oke, sudah cukup untuk sesi dokumentasinya. Mungkin terima kasih banyak kepada Bu Ira atas sesi yang telah dimoderatori. Semoga bermanfaat untuk kita semua. Oke, mungkin sekian dari saya. Mohon maaf apabila ada kekurangan. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih semuanya. Kita end ya.